So I just want to start with what's your name and what's the title of what you did in the Camden Yard project?
Janet Marie Smith, and I was the Vice President of Planning Development for the Baltimore Orioles from 1989 until '94.
And so before Camden Yards came along, what kind of work were you doing?
I had been using my planning and architecture degree as a basis for managing large urban projects, and had worked on Battery Park City in New York and Pershing Square in Los Angeles. And my interest in coming to Baltimore was because I had studied the city of Baltimore in planning school and knew how important it was that the way they had approached the redevelopment of the Inner Harbor. When industry left and containerization moved out to deeper water, Baltimore didn't sort of wallow in its, in its past. They pulled up their bootstraps and said, well, we need a whole new way of thinking about a city. And they really thought of downtown as an urban playground. And I was impressed that this idea of moving a sports venue into downtown to be a part of that world was their thinking. It was novel at the time.
And so, correct me if I'm wrong. You were living in Baltimore when the Camden Yards.
No, I moved here for that job.
For that job.
Yeah.
Okay. And so, how did you come to getting that job? Did they approach you first?
I wrote an old-fashioned letter. I was ready to move back to the East Coast. I was living in Los Angeles, and I was ready to move back to the East Coast, and I assumed I'd go back to New York. But I hadn't found a job that really interested me, and I had come to realize that I like projects better than jobs, if you can appreciate the distinction. And so I thought, well, I don't know, maybe I have one more project left in me before I go get serious about life. And I had gone to Memorial Stadium to watch the Orioles play in 1988, the year that they were worse than my favorite Atlanta Braves. I think they went on to lose 108 games. And sitting in the stands and kibitzing with fans, I heard that they were going to leave Memorial Stadium and build something new downtown. My first thought was, that's too bad. I kind of liked Memorial Stadium. It had a nice, comfortable, old shoe quality to it. But then a few weeks later, I had this epiphany. I thought, wait a minute, that's just like what we learned in school. There goes Baltimore putting something else in the middle of downtown that'll drop 3 million people a year into those hotel rooms, into the restaurants, and really be part of that whole Inner Harbor revitalization. So I did some research on who was running that project, and first wrote a letter to the Maryland Stadium Authority. And the then executive director, Chris Delaporte, called me and said, got your letter, got your resume, you would be totally perfect for this job, but you don't want to work for us, you want to work for the Orioles, because they have the rights in our lease to be leading the design. And I think they're going to be really strong advocates for that. And so I revamped my letter and wrote it to Larry Lucchino, and the rest is history, as they say. Although I will note that Larry had me interview with Herb Belgrad before he offered me the job. I think it was really important to him that the Orioles and the Maryland Stadium Authority have people that they respected between each of the other organizations, and that would work together as a team. So I think it's noteworthy that though I worked for the Orioles, my job felt like I had a responsibility to both the state of Maryland and the city of Baltimore. We really thought of it as a civic project.
And so you mentioned that you spoke to Larry Lucchino first about this job. Was he the one who interviewed you for it?
Yes, I interviewed with Larry in Washington
and
for
what was
the
that
job.
like?
Well, Larry's very, very quick with questions, and so I learned quickly I needed to be on my toes with crisp, short answers and the ability to defend my point. And while he has a way about him that feels combative, I think I knew intuitively that he was looking to see if I had thick enough skin and a strong enough backbone to take that kind of lobbing. And one thing I really appreciated about the interview was that after we'd talked for 45 minutes or so, he said, I have the plans in my office, do you have time to take a look at them and then maybe come back in here and we can talk about them? Of course, I'd flown there for the interview. Of course, I had time. So I spent maybe another, 45 minutes, an hour in his conference room looking at both the RTKL master plan and the drawings that HOK Sport had produced, and then went back in his office and we talked about it. And it was an excellent way to do the interview because I shared with him my honest opinions about it, and it created, I think, both a rapport about the topic at hand, because he was not a man of small talk, and allowed him to see how I would think about the project and how I might approach making suggestions. And happily, it all aligned with where he wanted to take things. And it ended up being a great run, not just at Camden Yards, but the years I worked with him later at Fenway Park, and then again at Polar Park, and a bit in San Diego.
Yeah, and so going back to that first interview or that first time you were able to give your thoughts on the stadium and all these plans and what your vision would be like, did you already have this vision that you wanted it to be like the retro classic ballpark? I mean, you said you loved Memorial Stadium as well. Did you want to bring all that culture and that kind of old-timey feel already? Or was that something that evolved as the project went on?
I think my interest in the project and my goals going in were to make it a good urban building. And I had read enough about Larry Lucchino's vision for the project to know that he was looking for an old-fashioned ballpark with modern amenities. That was a phrase that we would repeat over and over again. And of course, as I said, I had studied Baltimore and knew of the new development around the Inner Harbor, both by observation and through my classroom studies. So I felt all of these things were very aligned, that a good urban building was, old-fashioned ballparks were good urban buildings. You look at Ebbets, Shibe, Fenway, Wrigley, they were good urban buildings. They followed the rules of a good urban building, of a street wall sitting parallel to the sidewalk, of activity on the street, not just closing their doors and being dead to the world when there wasn't a baseball game. And I felt that all these things were very much aligned. But it was Larry Lucchino's vision. And I felt that the kinds of things I cared about and that I was schooled in and practiced in, because by then I had been working almost 10 years, I felt I could help guide the design to achieve those goals. And one of the reasons that Larry hired me was that he felt that in HOK Sport they had a ton of sports expertise. He didn't need another sports expert. So I felt empowered to bring this idea of urban design and storytelling and the functionality of the building, not only for the Orioles and their fans, but for the city of Baltimore. They helped round out, I think, the core of what HOK Sport was there to do, which was to create the ballpark itself.
And so, going back to the people you worked with throughout this project, who were those people that you most interacted with throughout your time working on Camden Yards?
Well, of course, I had a lot of rapport with Larry Lucchino and his staff. And within the Orioles, the key individuals would have been Bob Elward, who was in charge of our business operations and who played a really key role in mapping out the functions and how things would operate and what our aspirations were to be a successful business. Dr. Charles Steinberg, who was then working in the communications, public relations, and had a foot in baseball. So his notion of how to present the team, how to envelop the city so that it was the city's team. It wasn't just, we were caretakers, but it was the city of Baltimore, the state of Maryland's team, was a reoccurring theme. And then Frank Robinson, who was our manager, played a pivotal role in the field itself, the dimensions of the outfield wall, how we could make good use of the warehouse, which we fought to save, the way the clubhouse, the dugouts, the bullpens were designed. So it's a really nice little triumvirate within the Orioles that gave us the business acumen, the community spirit, and the baseball knowledge that Larry had set the tone for. And then Joe Spear, who was the principal architect at HOK Sport, was a really important figure, obviously, but not just important in this, but I love the fact that Herb Belgrad and Bruce Hoffman, who was the executive director of the Maryland Stadium Authority, were free with our access and rapport with Joe Spear and David Murphy, who was at RTKL and working on the master plan. It was a real collaboration, and that's not a word I use lightly, because I see a lot of institutions have such hard and fast rules about communication that you can't have easy collaboration. And I think Camden Yards and its longevity is a testament to the fact that we all brought something different to the table, but that it really did feel like a real collaboration. And Bruce Hoffman and Joe Spear are the two people that I felt the greatest sense of responsibility to and for, in making certain that the Orioles' perspective was represented, but they both heard us with, I think, really both an openness and an optimism that's reflected in the outcome of the building.
And you mentioned how it was such a big collaboration, and you had so many different people working on this. Was there any big disagreements between those different groups? What was those big disagreements?
Well, there were some classic disagreements. In hindsight, they seem laughable, but at the time, we all were anxious about the outcome. It's been well chronicled. Saving the warehouse was one, and I don't know that there was anyone in our core team, including the Stadium Authority, HOK Sport, who weren't in favor of saving the warehouse, but the Stadium Authority was very clear that it needed to be a financially responsible decision, not just one born out of passion or aesthetics or good urban design. And to the credit of Herb Belgrad, Bruce Hoffman, and all of the consultants that they employed, they took the time to do a study. And it was determined that indeed saving the warehouse and renovating that building to house the ushers' changing rooms, the central kitchen, the concessions, the Orioles offices, was actually a more cost-effective way of having that square footage than had we added it to the new construction and had to make everything bigger. The steel would have had to have held another floor, the elevators, the escalators, etc. So it seems obvious, I think, looking back on it, 30 plus years later, but that was a hot button at the time. And there was a lot of debate and delay over the choice of using steel trusses rather than concrete. And again, that was something that I don't think anyone disputed, that the steel trusses were a more aesthetically pleasing, more architectural feature more in line with the old ballparks, but there was a question about the cost. And we all brought different consultants to the table, and when we were able to prove to ourselves that the steel was not only less expensive, but would be quicker and easier to erect because we didn't have to wait for the temperature to be at the right place and all that kind of good stuff during the winter, that too became a unanimous decision, and one that I think we're all very proud of. So sure, there were probably more examples like that along the way, but I think the project reflects the respect and admiration that the team had for each other.
And so, as well, one last person that I know that you worked with a lot was David Ashton.
Yes.
and we actually just spoke to him
Oh,
earlier this
great.
week. Yeah,
Fantastic.
all
Good for
things to say
you.
about you. How did you guys meet and get him involved in the
Well, this
project?
is a longer story, so we're going to have to back up and redo a few pieces that I was trying to keep short. But in my exploration to learn something more about Baltimore and the future of the Orioles' new ballpark, since I didn't know anyone who lived here, I asked some of my friends and colleagues that did they know anyone? And Peter Katz, who I was in Los Angeles, okay, back up. Peter and I had worked together in New York, and we both moved to the West Coast at the same time. He to San Francisco and me to Baltimore. And I told him, me to LA, sorry. And I told Peter that I was interested in this job and that I was going to write a letter. Maybe he'd already written a letter, I can't remember. And Peter said, well, I know somebody in Baltimore. My former, I don't know how he knew him, but he knew Adam Gross of Air St. Gross. And he said, I just did their letterhead. Peter was a graphic designer. He said, I just did their letterhead. He said, I'll introduce you to Adam. Maybe he can tell you something about this. So I call Adam and introduce myself, and Adam's like, oh my gosh, we interviewed for that job. We didn't get the job, but we know all about it. So Adam has been now a close friend for decades, but I give him original credit for the education he gave me so that I was prepared for that interview. So as a result, since he'd given me good advice once, I went back to him several times. And one was when we started looking for a graphic designer. And we had interviewed several that had national acclaim. And I kept thinking maybe there's someone right under our nose that we just haven't found yet. And Adam said there might be. He said, why don't you call David Ashton? And David came down and walked the ballpark with us, and I shared with him some books that I had been using for research and Larry's ideas for this old-fashioned ballpark. And by then I'd done a good bit of research on the ballparks of the early classic era, which I shared with David. And when he came back with his proposal, even his proposal looked like something you could frame and hang at Camden Yards. And so, of course, Bruce Hoffman looked at these proposals. We had several with me, and he's like, do we even need to open them up? Like, this one is just so obviously captured the spirit of what we were trying to achieve. And David ended up being just an incredible partner for many years on that project. And many of the things that are so memorable that you still see highlighted in photographs, from the ornithologically correct bird on the gates to the BCB that's intertwined not only on the seat-in standard but on the clock on the scoreboard, are features that David brought to this project.
Well, again, thank you for taking the time with us. Sorry about what happened last time. So, one of the biggest moves, one of the biggest decisions in the whole project was the B&O warehouse. Something that really no stadium had done before, which is the true integration into a city. What was the thinking behind that, and did you have to fight to convince people it was the right move?
Since we were looking to emulate the older ballparks, and since what made the older ballparks like Ebbets and Fenway interesting is that they conform not only their architecture but their playing field to the shape of the block they were on, it seemed antithetical to the notion that we were going to create an old-fashioned ballpark with modern amenities in downtown Baltimore and tear out the very context that could give us a rationale to follow their lead and have an asymmetrical playing field, asymmetrical heights to the field walls, and unique features that would define Camden Yards. And I don't know that anyone thought that so much as it wasn't obvious, I think, until we really began to write that narrative. And yes, there were people, including famously John Stedman, who wrote for the paper, who had advocated tearing it down, thinking there would be a beautiful view of the harbor if it wasn't there. And preservation maybe wasn't as solidly accepted as a rationale for urban design as it might be today. I hope it would be today. So sure, there was controversy over it, but today, even in my memory, the edges around that seem smoother because it seems so logical. I can honestly say I can't imagine Camden Yards without it, and not just because of the postcard view, but it dictated everything we did, the materials that we used, the color palette that we used, the shape of the playing field, the relationship of the playing field to the right field wall. The creation of Eutaw Street never would have been had the warehouse not stayed. So there's nothing about Camden Yards that would have been the same had we not made that initial decision to keep the B&O warehouse.
Absolutely. And you mentioned Eutaw Street. Was that always going to go hand in hand with the B&O warehouse?
Yes.
And did you still want that type of street and that type of scene with or without the warehouse?
I don't think Eutaw Street could have happened without that. I just don't think it would have been. I don't even think we would have dreamed that. In fact, I would say the opposite. At the time, it was traditional to come into a baseball park from behind home plate and then spread out. And that was considered the more logical entry point. But once you position Camden Yards so that the third baseline is due north, getting the preferred sun condition on the playing field, it means home plate is the furthest away from the light rail, the existing parking garages, the waterfront promenade at the Inner Harbor, all the things that we wanted to be anchored to. So the idea of Eutaw Street was really thought of as a way of turning lemons into lemonade. We realized that some 60% of our fans were going to be entering the outfield, and the question was, how do we make them feel like they've arrived, even though they've still got to walk, some of them another 1,000 feet to get to their seats. And this idea of Eutaw Street came from the notion of keeping the warehouse, taking a street, Eutaw Street, and extending it through the site and putting turnstiles at either end of the street to create a complete 360-degree concourse on game days. Then the turnstiles disappear and it's part of the pedestrian environment of downtown the rest of the time. So no, couldn't have done Eutaw Street without the B&O warehouse.
It seems like a main goal of this project was to create that urban city integration and create an old-time ballpark in a city that people can come in and out of for entertainment. And few have done it well. Why is Camden Yards so special, and what makes their relationship with Baltimore work?
I think it's so authentic. I think there are a lot of ballparks that were built after Camden Yards that mimicked many of the decisions that went in. Many of them moved into urban centers, as the Orioles did, from Cleveland to Pittsburgh, the Rockies in Denver, Padres in San Diego, the Giants in San Francisco, and many of them look to their urban surroundings to also inform the architecture and the shape of the playing field. But because it was so new and novel to think of it that way, even though it was old, it was new was old again, or old was new again, or whatever the right, because we were just learning from what had happened in the early 1900s. I think the warehouse so defines Baltimore, and the skyline peeking up over that is so identified with Baltimore. Eutaw Street is so synonymous with the Orioles that I wouldn't go so far as to say it's hard to top the master, but it certainly did set a standard that I think has held for a full generation now.
Is the B&O warehouse your favorite aspect of the stadium, or is there something else that you always look to that you're
Sure.
really proud of?
No, absolutely. The saving the warehouse, the creation of Eutaw Street, and the wide concourses are my favorite parts. I love the scale of the building and things that are kind of a little bit geeky maybe for an interview like this, but because the playing field is 16 feet below street level, And because we had 3+ levels, depending on how you count the club and suite level, and the building itself was 110 feet high, this idea of setting the upper deck back and exposing the steel and not having the masonry go all the way up so that it felt more in scale and harmony with Ridgely's Delight is another one of my real favorite parts of the project. Things that I think people may feel, but perhaps only architects or engineers would look at it and dissect it that way, but I think it gives it a level of intimacy. And I also love that one of the things that we borrowed from Fenway Park was this idea of concourses that had lots of amenities within them, but then when you walk through the vomitory, you're sort of greeted by this wide expanse of sunshine and green grass, and the sort of surprise of the contrast of the dark concourses compared to the brilliance of the game itself is sort of a lovely transition, and one that I still enjoy as a fan.
Did the green from Camden Yards come from the green in Fenway, or was that a totally different
No,
decision?
it was totally different. I do think we felt green was a good park color, but it really came from looking at, in Baltimore, looking in the mirror. Green is just a classic park color, and we worked really hard on selecting a shade of green that felt park-like and that would complement the red brick of the warehouse, which we were looking to use on the facade of the ballpark.
Right. And
Don't let me slip and say stadium. Larry would fine me $1.
yeah, we heard about that. Decisions like that, at the time, a ballpark designer wasn't your typical architectural path. That wasn't what you had been doing up until that point. Were there moments where your perspective felt questioned, and how did you handle that, knowing that clearly what you ended up doing was right?
That's an excellent question, because certainly there were many times that I think, not coming from sports, that it would have been easy to have been made to feel that I was out of line with something. But I felt like Larry Lucchino always had my back. I think he believed what he said when he hired me, which was that he wanted to push the envelope. He did not want another stadium. He did not want Kansas City with bricks. He had high confidence that HOK Sport and all of their consultants were going to deliver all the things that we needed in terms of a playing field that would drain, field lights that were going to illuminate the field, a sound system, a scoreboard, great sight lines. I think he felt totally confident that all of the things that needed to work were going to work, and that my role was to make certain that they both worked for the Orioles organization, but more importantly, or maybe harder to achieve to him, was how to make certain that this idea of an old-fashioned ballpark with modern amenities had life. And that really was new and novel. Where he got that vision from, we can only assume he meant what he said, which was that growing up in Forbes Field in Pittsburgh, he saw a magic in a ballpark that simply didn't exist in a stadium. And he would often point to the fact that the two smallest baseball parks in the major leagues, Wrigley and Fenway, consistently had the highest attendance no matter what their record on the field. And this was an era when so many teams were playing in 60,000 seat multi-purpose stadiums. So his point was, look, the atmosphere matters. Having a smaller, more intimate, baseball-only park is an attraction for a baseball fan. And because I had recently worked on Battery Park City, which is in its own way shared some of the same challenges, for many decades, planners in New York had tried to create this sort of utopia of towers in a park adjacent Lower Manhattan, and it never worked. And eventually the group that I worked for developed a plan that was a sympathetic interpretation of a new extension of Lower Manhattan, and learning that kind of contextual way of thinking about planning and buildings so that the fabric of the urban tapestry was more important than the individual buildings was by then a very important touch point for me, and one that I thought was really important for Camden Yards. It's intentionally not a standout building. It's intentionally trying to marry itself into the community so that it feels one with Ridgely's Delight, one with downtown, one with the warehouse, that it's not a standout look at me building. It's I'm part of the family. I'm part of the urban family.
One thing I got from David in our interview on Monday is that you guys never questioned the confidence in your work, and you always felt like you were on the right path, and you really knew that this is something you were good at. Even so, in a role that hadn't been done before, how did you manage being able to mix the integration and the modernization of the stadium? And was there any time where you felt like you had to maybe sacrifice one for the other?
Well, that's an excellent question, too. I'm going to think about the latter part to address the first part. I think one of the reasons that we felt confident in our work is that our job was right here. We weren't trying to imagine how we would be viewed nationally, who thought we were crazy, who as Larry Lucchino later said, all we were trying to do was build the best ballpark we could for the Baltimore Orioles in the city of Baltimore for the state of Maryland. That it landed with such positive reception on the national scene was not only a total surprise, but it simply wasn't a goal. It just wasn't where our head was at. And I think it allowed us to be confident that we were doing the right thing, because we were looking broadly at how this could be a good civic building in our city. And I think we had confidence we could achieve that. And perhaps it was because it was in the wake of such a successful transformation of Baltimore's Inner Harbor and the Festival Marketplace, and what the aquarium and the Science Center and what were then new hotels had brought to Baltimore. All projects that were fueled by the passion of the then Governor William Donald Schaefer, who'd been mayor of Baltimore. So our reference points were strong, even though this was a different agenda. They were strong. And to your question of did we have to compromise? Well, sure, there were things that we had to compromise. Can I give you an example? I have to think about that. Well, I guess one is that had money been no object, money and time, we might have done a full concourse underneath service level underneath the seating bowl, so there would have been more room for broadcast trucks, for recycling, for trash pickup, for the way we think of a clubhouse today, which is a much bigger footprint than we did back then. So certainly having more space in what you would call back a house would have been desirous, and we made a conscious decision to scale that back to only go from third base over to the right field foul pole in order to put the dollars we had into fan-facing elements. And I would still argue that that was the right decision. But yes, there were compromises. But to the credit of the Maryland Stadium Authority, particularly Herb Belgrad and Bruce Hoffman, I think every time there was a decision to be made, their overarching goal was to make certain it was the right one for the longevity of the building and the fans that would be using it over the course of generations.
Well, speaking of compromise, a cherry on top to a truly well-built stadium is a great name, but I feel like that kind of took a while to decide. Was there a story behind that, and did you think it would be something else?
Sure. There wasn't a name. I can't even remember now what the original documents call it. I think maybe new stadium for Baltimore. Maybe it even says new ballpark in some of them, but certainly doesn't have a name in there. And I think because it was sited at Camden Yards and that just flowed so well and evoked the kind of feeling that we came to calling it Camden Yards colloquially. I can't say that word. And yet the Orioles had originally played in a ballpark known as Oriole Park that was a few blocks away from Memorial Stadium, and that was kind of rattling around in our heads as an option. There were some who had advocated calling it Babe Ruth Stadium since he was born in Baltimore and had played for the Orioles, and his father's tavern was just a few blocks in birthplace, or a few blocks from Oriole Park at Camden Yards. So there were a lot of ideas kicked around, and I would say that Camden Yards was probably, in many ways, the clear favorite, but I think when it came time to make an actual choice, the Orioles felt that having their name in the name was important, maybe in part for trademark reasons, so that they would own the rights to apparel and the use of the name. My memory's kind of vague on what thumb we had on the scale at the time, but it's sort of a famous story that's almost true, that Eli Jacobs, our owner, suggested Oriole Park, and Governor Schaefer suggested Camden Yards, and they compromised by Oriole Park at Camden Yards. That's a little bit of a short version of maybe a longer truth, but I think it's proven to be a good name and allows us to use both interchangeably.
Sure. Well, thank you so much.
Absolutely.
Take over the last part of the question.
Your questions are great.
So to start off, you mentioned earlier that you obviously going into this project didn't come from a sports background. So to kind of go further into that point for yourself, was there anything heading into the project or actually working on it in your process or just you as a designer that you felt changed and you carried with you to other projects that you worked on?
Well, I think the methodology that I used to research this is one that I still use today. I love research. Maybe I'll do that in my next life. And I think the fact that I was a fan first really helped because I'm a baseball fan. I love going to ballparks. I have always been interested in the fact that they are such a reflection of the city they're in, and they're so different from city to city. Even then, there was no mistaking Yankee Stadium for Shea Stadium, even though they were separated by only a few miles. There was just something so different about going to watch a game in Anaheim versus Dodger Stadium. So I think being a fan first gave me a way of thinking. I've mentioned how important the work at Battery Park City was in shaping my experience with translating a city to a new part of the city. And so I looked to do that here in Baltimore, to think about how to read the site and really think about what would feel comfortable on this site and how to give good direction and feedback to both RTKL and HOK Sport. I want to be real clear, I wasn't the designer for this, so my role was to give them feedback and input. But I felt that was a language that I taught myself, and I loved that part of the research, and I love that some of the research that I did now has a home at the National Baseball Hall of Fame. It's fun to think about it because today you can buy any number of beautiful coffee table books about the old ballparks, but back then there was one called Ballparks, and there was Philip Best's book, Green Cathedrals. And there wasn't much else published about this. And one of my good friends in Los Angeles was John Pastier, who was the architectural critic for the Herald. And he was a huge baseball fan, and I had gone to games in both Anaheim and Dodger Stadium with him and had spent 9 innings of baseball talking about the ballpark and asking him about different aspects of it. And he was a really important part of my research. I called on him after I took this job, and he came out several times and shared with us his slide collection, his postcard collection, his original research into ballparks. So yes, I still do that on my projects, and I think it served me well then, and so it's a formula that I've tried to stick with.
Is there a particular part of the entire process that you view as kind of like one of the most important parts of it that got it across the finish line, or just a part that like you really loved? to
Oh,
bring to
yeah.
people?
No, absolutely. It's such a collaboration, and there were so many ideas that that came out of the rapport with other people that worked on this, and just conversations. Like one of my favorite pieces was that we brought the foul pole from Memorial Stadium and the welcome home sign from Memorial Stadium to Camden Yards. But that was an idea that that came from watching a game with Roland Heeman the last month of the season on 33rd Street. Like, oh, we're going to miss this place, and maybe we should take a few things with us. And so my point is, even if you have an idea yourself, it seldom comes from something that's totally internal. It's so often shaped by your conversations, your experiences, the things that other people have to say. And yet, when I go to Camden Yards today, there's so many things there that I feel in my heart of hearts I love, and I know could have been different had I not been there. And it's a wonderful feeling, not a braggy one, just a wonderful feeling that you had a role in those things. And I'm often pleased beyond words, really, that some of the traditions that we started, such as this idea of putting the home run balls on Utah Street, have been carried for this long. The idea of the flags in the descending order, the standing, the idea of the Orioles Hall of Fame plaques being on Utah Street in a public place where you could see them 365 days a year. I mean, all of those were goals to allow the building to tell its own story, to create moments where during the game you could kibitz with other fans and have something to talk about that would educate you better about the game you were watching and about the team. And maybe I felt so strongly about that because I got the job from kibitzing with another fan in the stands. So I understood and appreciate maybe the power of those casual conversations as honestly the way it can change your life trajectory.
On the topic of opening day, the first thing we wanted to ask you was, did you sleep that night going into opening day? Were you able to get any rest before that first game played?
I don't remember that part. I do remember, even though we'd hosted exhibition games with the Mets, as soon as they were over, we raced back into work mode and painted walls and changed netting and moved things around based on how we had seen fans react to things and how we'd seen players react to things. So that first game was just, I remember when it was over just thinking, wow, she played like 9 innings of regulation baseball in the books, like it really happened. And I think until that moment, we were all anxious. In a way I've maybe never been anxious about an opening day. Like, you're always racing a deadline when you're working on projects, but this was more than racing a deadline. This was racing a new reality of what baseball could be for this century. Not to overstate it, but like it had been since 1912, 1914, since a ballpark like this had been built. So I think we were anxious that it prove itself out to be real. And I wonder sometimes looking back on it, what were we so worried about? Because by then, Pilot Field had opened up in Buffalo as a minor league park that had some of the same attributes. So, maybe it was just our own anxiety, but that's okay. You can only feel how you feel.
And when you were working on opening day, I'm obviously sure that you were kind of a little all over the place, but what was the consensus that you had heard from like everybody there? Did people like really like love it? Were there criticisms that you heard that you kind of like stored in the back of your mind? What was your overall like takeaways that you've heard from other people?
Well, I think we felt really good about it. By then, sort of somewhat out of the blue, it seems like there had been national press given to it that was validating. I remember two of the morning shows. You have to remember this was back when morning television mattered. There were three stations, 4 counting TBS or something. Being in the national spotlight, Paul Goldberger, the critic of the New York Times, architectural critic of the New York Times, had written on it. Herbert Muschamp, who had written a really beautiful piece on it. So I think we had started to appreciate that we had created something that had sparked some attention beyond just our immediate audience, and the feedback had been terrific. And so then the test was, could we really play baseball here? Could you really have a fair game? And that was one of Frank Robinson's one of his most important objectives, was that the park play fair, that it not favor hitters over pitchers, that it not favor lefties over righties. I mean, he really felt strongly about the fairness of this, and that's not something to be taken lightly when your goal is also to create a symmetry to the park. And so I think when we crossed that hurdle from being just a welcome architectural piece that had gotten nice attention in the few weeks before opening day, and been able to prove that it played fair, as Frank Robinson would have said, it made us all feel kind of really complete. And I would say, too, that perhaps the fact that Major League Baseball had awarded us the 1993 All-Star Game gave us a moment to look forward to beyond just opening day, so that we got past that April 6th date, and they were like, okay, let's make sure we get all the kinks out, and let's get ready to be on the national stage. And as I recall, we had a really good season in '92, and while the Orioles didn't make the playoffs, it wasn't until August that it became apparent we weren't going to, so it was an exciting season. And it was it felt good at the time. It feels good looking back on it.